Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we are doing the part 2 of my 2028 March Madness bracket for 2026. In the last video we went through the first 32 names on this list, 16 Democrats and 16 Republicans, and we have gotten that list down to 16. In today's video we're going to go through all the matchups and we're going to get that list down even smaller to the final 8 candidates remaining, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans by the end of the video. This is what in March Madness they would call the Sweet 16. So we have a lot to go over, so with that said, let's get started. For the first matchup, we're going to start on the Democratic side. We have the number 1 seed taking on the number 8 seed, and this is the former Vice President Kamala Harris taking on Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Now, this is a very interesting matchup, but one that's probably heavily favored in the former Vice President's direction. In the polling data that we have for this race thus far, this is from the Vote Hub Democratic primary for 2028. Harris is usually polling in either first or second place, and in this margin, she's at 25.2, so clearly in first place. Now, Pritzker, for his own right, is naturally not included in this polling average of the top 6 candidates or so for the Democrats. However, in the race to the White House polling average for the Democrats, Pritzker is included, and he is down at 3.3%, which would be right around 7th place in this average. Now, Kamala Harris is still in first place in this one, but she is at 24% on this. So there's a clear polling advantage for Kamala Harris in this matchup against J.B. Pritzker, and it makes sense given that she is the 1 seed. Prior to the start of this video series, I looked at a lot of the top polling averages and political prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket for the rankings on this list, and Kamala Harris started out at the top for a very strong reason. Without really too much to go into this, Kamala Harris, I believe, would beat J.B. Pritzker in a Democratic primary. I don't think she would sweep everything. I think J.B. Pritzker would probably win his home state of Illinois and maybe do well in some of the Midwestern states surrounding Illinois, but Kamala Harris I think would do very well in the early Democratic primary states, especially South Carolina and Nevada, and probably do very well in places like New Hampshire and Iowa as well, though Pritzker would have an opportunity in Iowa, but given that she's the former VP, very high name identification, and all the resources at her disposal, I think Harris would start out with a clear advantage over Pritzker and would win in this Democratic primary matchup. Next up, we have number 4 seed versus number 5 seed, and this is one of my favorite matchups of the video. At number 4, we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus Josh Shapiro. Now, this is very fascinating as AOC is the U.S. representative from New York. Despite being one of a few hundred representatives in the House, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the most well-known figures in Democratic politics and someone that's been very good at getting a lot of younger Americans, a lot of Gen Z and millennials to be brought into the political conversation. And I think her candidacy for 2028 is something that's going to be very interesting if she does decide to run, and one that can't be ruled out. Because a main point for this matchup is that what's missing from 2016 and 2020 is that there's no Bernie Sanders running in this race. So who is going to be that Democratic candidate that gets a lot of those millennial Gen Z voters, those on the younger side that are very motivated to get out and vote in the primaries? Typically those are voters on the more farther ends of the party, meaning more farther left and farther right. And for AOC, being someone that's done the Fight Oligarchy tour with Bernie Sanders, she seeks to potentially benefit the most from Sanders not running and get a lot of those younger voters come out and vote for it. Now, in this matchup, she's facing off against Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, who he represents one of the most important battleground states in all of the United States, and that gives him a certain leg up for sure in a general election. His biggest issue is going to be having to win the Democratic primary. Now, the Democratic primary is going to be tough for Shapiro, given there are several Democrats running who have higher name identification than him, including the former VP and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Shapiro strikes me as someone that's a very strong, effective speaker, and if he got to a general election, he is someone that I believe would have a very strong chance at winning a general election, but his biggest hurdle would be getting through the primary. And at the early polling data thus far, the numbers seem to reflect that as well. In the Vote Hub polling average, AOC is currently polling around 9.4%, which will put her in 4th place. Shapiro is at 5.5% in 5th place. So in the seating, they're very close, though AOC's support is nearly double what Shapiro's is. Now, for the race to the White House polling average, AOC's polling at 8.4%, Shapiro's at 6.2%. So the standings are still the same, with Cortez in 4th and Shapiro in 5th, but the margins of lead in this one are only 2%. This is why the matchup of AOC versus Shapiro is 4v5, is the polling is incredibly tight. The polling markets and such on this one are incredibly tight, and I really think it would be a very close divided Democratic primary, where in a lot of the early states in the Midwest, you would see Josh Shapiro do well in the Rust Belt areas, and do well in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, potentially, even a state like New Hampshire. I think you can see Josh Shapiro do well. But then you also have AOC, who I think is someone that will bring out a lot of younger Democratic voters. You'll see her do well in a lot of very big population states like New York, like California, like New Jersey, like New England, pretty much all of New England. And then it comes down to who ultimately edges out who in a very close Democratic primary. This one came very close to being a potential upset, but I do narrowly give the edge to AOC, despite the fact that Josh Shapiro is a very skilled politician. I think without Bernie Sanders in the race, a lot of younger Democratic voters are going to flock to her, and it's going to give her a narrow edge over Josh Shapiro in a very close Democratic primary. Next up, we have the number 3 versus number 6 seed matchup, and this is going to be Pete Buttigieg, the former Joe Biden administration official, and I believe was Secretary of Transportation, and he was also very notable the 2020 Democratic candidate for president who really caught fire then, going up against Governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear. Now, I think this one is more of I would say a low-key, very competitive type of election. And my thought process for this one is Pete Buttigieg is someone that a lot of Democrats that were old enough to vote, that paid attention in 2020, will remember Pete Buttigieg's name. Now, Buttigieg, throughout really the entire process of the 2020 primary, really caught fire in the last 6 months of the campaign. And he was someone that was polling usually in the top 3 with Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and him would be right around 3rd place. Now, ultimately, I think it was either right before or during Super Tuesday, Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and a few other Democratic candidates dropped out of the race, and essentially all their support consolidated behind Joe Biden. Whereas Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were splitting the progressive vote, and ultimately that led to Biden winning the Democratic primary. But Buttigieg didn't drop out because he didn't have any support at all. He just didn't have enough support to win these primary states when Joe Biden was already polling ahead of him. Now, this time around, Buttigieg starts out in the number 3 seed, and I think it's because he has a very strong chance in this Democratic primary. There's Kamala Harris, there's Gavin Newsom, who start out as the big names for right now. Buttigieg is the only one, actually Kamala Harris ran in 2020, but she did not get very far. Buttigieg is the only one that ran in 2020 and got to relatively close to getting the nomination in that one. Now, Biden obviously had it locked up decently early on once Buttigieg dropped out, but Buttigieg is someone that starts out with a decent floor of support. Now, he'll do well nationally among Democrats and maybe some of those Democratic voters that supported him last time, and will have a strong national name identification. Andy Beshear is someone that is very popular in the state of Kentucky, and someone that a Democrat that's more of trying to unite the party and also unite a lot of independents and even some disillusioned Republicans. He may be the type of Democrat that can do that, sort of in a mold of for an older example, Bill Clinton, and for a modern example like him and James Tallarico. Someone the Democrats can try and get independents and Republicans to vote for him. Now, what that means for a Democratic primary is for Andy Beshear to win, he would have to do very well in the rural states, which I expect that he will, but he'll also have to go into and be competitive in places like Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada and Illinois. And these are places that Pete Buttigieg, at very least, polled very strongly in 2024 and has started out thus far for 2028, polling very strongly as well. For the early polls thus far, Pete Buttigieg is polling in 3rd place at 9.5% in the Vote Hub poll. As for Andy Beshear, he's polling in 6th place at 2.6%. So Buttigieg is leading by roughly about 7 points to start out so far on the Vote Hub average. For a race to the White House, we have Buttigieg also in 3rd place at 10.6%. As for Andy Beshear, he's down the bottom of the screen polling at 2.9%. So right around a similar gap of about 7 points. So what this all means is that Buttigieg versus Andy Beshear, both of these candidates I think will be competitive in a Democratic primary in a head-to-head matchup, but they may get a little bit drowned out, especially Andy Beshear, by the candidates who are more well-known nationally and have a bigger following online on social media and among the younger Democrats. Sort of how AOC, I think, is able to get a lot of younger Democrats that are more on the farther left to be motivated to get out and vote for them. I think Buttigieg captures a lot of those Democratic voters as well, who are maybe a little bit more towards the center than AOC is, but certainly are not like moderate centrist Democrats. I think Buttigieg can do a good job at getting those Democrats. Beshear would certainly be someone that can kind of capture a lot of aspects of the Democratic Party, but he would have to get to the general. And I think Pete Buttigieg is too much of a powerhouse in this matchup for Beshear to ultimately do that. So with that reasoning, Pete Buttigieg, I have winning. Another favorite advances to the next round. Now we have the final matchup on the Democratic side, number 2 versus number 7, Gavin Newsom versus Mark Kelly. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, really needs no introduction. He has been one of the most prominent Democrats on the media since Donald Trump got elected president again to a second term. He is 100% a pro-Donald Trump critic, and he has been positioning to run for president in 2028 ever since, and it has done a lot of really good work for him. He is known by a lot of people as the most notable Democrat that's out speaking against Trump. And if the Democrats in 2028, it's going to be a big question of what do the Democrats want to do. Are they angry? Do they want someone that's going to 100% rebuke Donald Trump? Or do they want someone that's going to try and be a unifier? If they want someone that's 100% anti-Trump going the opposite direction, Gavin Newsom is positioning himself as that Democrat and as someone that's starting out to a very early lead. Now for Mark Kelly, the senator of Arizona, his advantage in this race is he represents a swing state of Arizona, a state that Donald Trump won in 2024, that Joe Biden won in 2020, and that plays a very critical role for the electoral aspects of the 2028 election. From an overall matchup perspective, though, for Mark Kelly, this really isn't going to be too fair of a fight for him, as he's going up against Newsom, who has a lot of national identification, has a lot of momentum on his side, has a lot of money coming in, and it's just really not too much of a fair fight. As for the polling, it shows this pretty clearly. Newsom in the Vote Hub average is at 20 points, 20%, and only down to Kamala Harris by about 5 points. As for Mark Kelly, he's not included on this average, but in race to the White House, he is. Mark Kelly's at 4.7%, but Newsom in this one is still at 19. So obviously, in a head-to-head matchup, there'd be probably a narrowing of the gap as more undecideds go for each respective candidate. But for Newsom versus Kelly, it's not really a question who would win this one. Gavin Newsom would win. He would advance to the next round. He's the number 2 seed for a reason. As of today, Newsom is one of the likely favorites to be the 2028 Democratic nominee, and that really goes without saying. I know a lot of watchers are probably hoping for an upset through this video, but I don't think the 2 versus 7 seed is going to be where an upset happens, especially not with Newsom leading the front there. So those are the Democratic matchups. Now we're on to the Republican ones. The Republican ones we have for the number 1 versus number 8 seed, we have Vice President J.D. Vance going up against Republican Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Gabbard is serving in the Trump-Vance administration as well, but similar to the Kamala Harris-J.B. Pritzker one and the Newsom versus Mark Kelly one, this just really on paper is not too much of a fair fight. J.D. Vance is viewed by pretty much everybody as the presumptive 2028 Republican nominee if he does decide to run. Only Marco Rubio running would make this even remotely competitive. And when you look at the polling numbers thus far, Real Clear Politics, the Vote Hub does not have a Republican primary average yet, but Real Clear Politics does. Vance leads at 44.9%. Donald Trump Jr. is in second place, even though I'm not including him in this bracket challenge. I don't believe he's going to run, and he said he's not going to run. But even still, the next closest candidate would be Rubio at 12.7. J.D. Vance is the clear frontrunner for 2028 right now on the Republican side. And the average Tulsi Gabbard's polling right around 1.3% on this one. On race to the White House, J.D. Vance is at 43.2%. And you can see down at the bottom of the screen that Tulsi Gabbard is actually not even on this polling average. So Vance clearly is a favorite to start out for Vance versus Gabbard, and without a doubt, he would win and advance to the next round. Next, we have the number 4 versus number 5 seed, and this is former South Carolina governor and ambassador to the United Nations and 2024 presidential candidate Nikki Haley, taking on also 2024 presidential candidate and President Trump administration official, the Make America Healthy Again movement leader, Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is a very interesting matchup because they represent almost two completely polar opposite ends of the Republican Party. Now, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I don't believe 100% has said that he is a Republican, so him running in the Republican primary would be interesting because he's not totally a Republican, but he's working with President Trump and the Trump administration, clearly has a lot of supporters in the Republican Party, and he represents someone that's definitely in the Donald Trump new MAGA Republican Party. Whereas Nikki Haley represents the Republican Party before Trump of the neoconservative George Bush, Mitt Romney type Republican Party that likely is going to be looking for a return once Donald Trump is out of office at the end of 2028. Now, for this matchup, it's very interesting. I do have Haley as the 4th seed and Kennedy as the 5th, but the polling on this is so incredibly tight. For Real Clear Politics, Kennedy's in 4th place at 3.8%. Nikki Haley's at 3.3%, only a difference of 0.5%. Now, on Race to the White House, in this one, Nikki Haley leads at 3.8%. RFK Jr. is at 3.6%. This one's really interesting. Now, for the Republican primary, Nikki Haley got, even though Donald Trump ultimately won and won heavily decisively in the Republican primary in 2024, Nikki Haley was getting a decent amount of the vote in several states as the main anti-Trump Republican candidate. Certainly, there were a lot of anti-Trump Republicans. There are also a lot of independents and even some Democrats that may have registered to vote in the Republican primaries as a vote against Trump. And she got a lot of those votes. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when he was running as an independent, obviously he never, I don't believe, made it to the ballot. He might have made it in a few states, but he ultimately didn't make it in most states. But in the early polls I remember covering on the channel, RFK Jr. was starting out with a decent amount of support as a third-party candidate before ultimately endorsing Donald Trump. So RFK Jr. certainly has a good following among Republicans and among independents as well that will probably turn out for him in a Republican primary if he is ultimately running. Now, obviously, a lot of Democrats and a lot of independents do not like RFK Jr., and that would certainly hurt him potentially in a general election. But as for the Republican primary, especially working with President Trump in the second Trump term, I do think that gives him a little bit of an added boost that running as an independent he did not ultimately have before. So RFK Jr. is going to be interesting to see after the 2028 election of how much of his support sticks with him, and does he gain any support or does he lose support from where he was in 2024. Haley versus RFK Jr. is very, very close. If you've been watching thus far, despite some close calls, I have given every single matchup to the favorite in this bracket challenge thus far, and that streak is breaking right here with RFK Jr. winning as the number 5 seed and advancing to the next round, and what I think would be a very close Republican primary, where Nikki Haley, I think, would win the Iowa caucus, and then RFK Jr. would win the state of New Hampshire, and RFK Jr. would then trail to Nikki Haley and lose Nikki Haley's home state of South Carolina. RFK Jr. goes out and wins the state of Nevada, and then it's really a back and forth grudge match between these two, but RFK Jr. ultimately ends up winning is how I have this going. Next, we have the number 3 versus number 6 seeds. We have the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, taking on Vivek Ramaswamy, the Republican presidential candidate from 2024, running for governor of Ohio. Now, this is an interesting matchup from the fact that both of these candidates were actual candidates in 2024 and were primary rivals at one point, even appearing on the same debate stage. Now, Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy, despite running against Trump in 2024, I would say were still different degrees of rivals to Donald Trump. Vivek Ramaswamy never really went after Donald Trump in 2024, despite running for president. He more cozied up to himself as a MAGA ally of Trump, where Ron DeSantis went after Donald Trump directly in 2024, and obviously we all saw how that went. Donald Trump did very well. Ron DeSantis, I think, dropped out either right before Iowa or right after Iowa. Really never had a chance in the 2024 primary. And obviously there was a lot of bad blood between Trump and DeSantis that seems to be smoothed over a lot in Trump's second term. And so ultimately what that means for 2028, we'll have to wait and see. But even with all that, Ron DeSantis is still one of the most popular Republican governors among Republican primary voters throughout the country. He's one of the most well-known as well. Vivek Ramaswamy, for his own right, is certainly well-known among a lot of Republican primary voters. He started out polling pretty decently in 2024, despite never running for office before. Now he's running for governor of Ohio in 2026. The polls show a very tight race for the general election, despite the fact that he looks very strong in the Republican primary. How this one ultimately shakes up for the polling thus far, DeSantis is at 7.6%, starting out in third place on Real Clear Politics. Ramaswamy's down at 2.3%, so he still has a little bit of a following nationally, Ramaswamy, but not as much as Ron DeSantis does. In race to the White House, it's similar. DeSantis at 7.8%, Vivek Ramaswamy at 2.8%, so a 5-point lead. Ultimately, how I think this one goes down without too much of a surprise is Ron DeSantis would win against Vivek Ramaswamy and advance to the next round. He's not as strong as the favorite as like JD Vance or say Gavin Newsom was with the 2v7 seed or the 1v8 seed, but DeSantis, certainly one of the most formidable governors nationwide, someone that's very well known in Republican circles. Not having to run against Donald Trump, I think, would boost his popularity and the amount of Republicans that would probably vote for him in 2028, and that would give him enough to advance to the next round. Our final matchup on the Republican side, we have the number 2 versus number 7 seeds. We have Marco Rubio versus Ted Cruz. The one-time 2016 foes facing off for the next spot to advance in the bracket challenge, and what a difference time can make. Back in 2016, nearly 10 years ago now, we saw Rubio and Cruz facing off as rivals. Towards the end, they did seem to unite to try and stop Donald Trump from getting the nomination, as Trump was their main enemy, sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Ultimately, that did not work. Donald Trump won. Now in Trump's second term, both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio have become very strong allies of President Trump. Marco Rubio now serving as Donald Trump's Secretary of State in his second term. Ted Cruz still senator from the state of Texas, but is a very prominent, vocal Donald Trump supporter in the media a lot. Now, what this means for 2028, unfortunately for Ted Cruz, with Marco Rubio being Trump's Secretary of State, constantly being in the news and constantly being praised by President Trump, things are really out of hand for Cruz here. Rubio is polling in second place at 12.7%, with even the most 3 recent polls having Rubio among 16 to 20 points. Actually, even the most 4 most recent polls having him in the double digits. Whereas Ted Cruz, despite having a little bit of a following, he's at 2.3% in the polling averages, nowhere near the level that Marco Rubio has now. Had Rubio not become Secretary of State, his polling numbers here would likely not have been that high, and if he decided to run in 2028 without being in the second Trump administration, he'd likely be polling similarly to Ted Cruz, right around that 1 to 2 point margin. Being Trump's Secretary of State, though, has given him a lot of clout in the Republican primary, now at 14.1% in the race to the White House average. Cruz is at 2.4%. From a polling standpoint, this really is not that close. Though Cruz ended up having higher polling numbers than Marco Rubio in 2016, and how that primary played out in the Donald Trump Republican Party in 2028 to succeed Donald Trump, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio certainly has the advantage, and I think we would see Marco Rubio essentially do a clean sweep of the Republican primary against Ted Cruz, and Cruz would probably drop out in this matchup very early on. So the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is surging in several polls and prediction markets for 2028, wins and advances to the next round. So with that said, after those matchups, we officially have the final 8 remaining candidates, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, going into the next round, and let's break these down. The number 1 seed, Kamala Harris, will be facing off against the number 4 seed, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to advance into the final 2 for the Democrats. That'll be a very, very good matchup to watch out for. Next, we have the number 3 seed, Pete Buttigieg, facing off against the number 2 seed, Gavin Newsom, to also face off for the final 2 Democratic spot. That will be an absolutely very interesting grudge match between Newsom and Buttigieg as well. On the Republican side, you have 2 very prominent MAGA Republican Vice President J.D. Vance at the 1 seed, facing off against RFK Jr., the 5 seed, after upsetting Nikki Haley to go into the final 2. And then you'll have the number 3 seed, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, facing off against fellow Floridian, the Battle of Florida, number 2 seed, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So we have the Battle of Florida for DeSantis versus Rubio. We have the MAGA showdown for Vance versus RFK Jr. Harris versus AOC. We have, I would say that one could be sort of like a progressive type bowl between Harris and AOC, who can get more younger Democrats out to vote. And then Newsom versus Buttigieg. This could be, I don't really have a great one for that one. This could be like the, I'm going to say the Midwestern showdowns. The Midwestern states will play a pretty prominent role in that one maybe. That could be one, but by the time the next video comes out, I'll work on a better one for Newsom versus Buttigieg. But that one's TBD. The Progressive Bowl of Harris versus AOC, the MAGA Bowl for Vance versus RFK Jr., and the Battle of Florida for DeSantis versus Rubio. Leave all your thoughts down in the comment section below for what you think of this video and the matchups in this one, and for the next round of matchups, how do you think they are going to go? Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to hit like and subscribe if you've been enjoying this video and enjoying this series so far, and I hope to see you in a future video.